to the beautiful Birchfield Penny Art Center here at Buffalo State University. My name is Kathy Creighton, and I'm the director of Cornell University's ILR Buffalo CoLab. We recently relocated our offices onto this campus, and we're really delighted to be working in conjunction with SUNY, Buffalo State, and UB. So I want to say thank you for some of our elected officials who are here. Majority Leader Crystal Peoples-Stokes. Sorry, you're not in my. Thank you for coming. Deputy County Executive Lisa Chimera is here. Thanks for your support of Cornell and higher education. And then we have Assembly Member Rivera's staff is here. Assembly Member, who else am I missing? Shout it out if you're here.
Senator Gallagher.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for being here. Tell the Senator thank you. And Karen McMahon, staff is here as well. So I want to just talk a little bit about, I'm only going to talk for 3 minutes. A little bit about Cornell University and our mission. So Cornell University is New York State's land-grant school, and as such, Cornell is charged with advancing the lives and the livelihoods of New Yorkers through teaching, research, and public service. And as a university, one of our goals is to democratize data, which means taking complex data sources and putting them together in a way that's understandable and readable to the average person. And we take that data and we follow it over time to see what the trends are. Earlier this year, we were approached by the Community Foundation for Greater Buffalo, who asked Cornell if it would gather information to show what impacts federal funding and policy changes were having on our local economy. And so, in collaboration with the Community Foundation, we started working on this mapping project, which we're rolling out today. So I want to thank Betsy Constantine, Maria White, Cara Mattaleone, and Lily Karras from the Community Foundation for coming to us with this wonderful idea. Pause. Dr. Rusty Weaver created this map. He's a quantitative geographer, and he's the director of research at Cornell. Dr. Weaver compiles data by state. We did much more than looking at our local economy. This is a mapping project for the entire state of New York. And it shows the impact of the federal funding is going to have on New York in the coming, what's not already happening, in the coming months and years. And as information becomes available, we're going to update this map into the foreseeable future. Preliminary results are sobering. It shows a loss of billions of dollars in federal funding to New York State via losses to grant funding, contract funding, and job losses. We're also tracking whether work is moving from offshore to onshore to see whether tariff policies are having their intended impact, and we'll be following that also over time. So our agenda this morning is for Rusty to go through the mapping project to show you how it works. We're going to then share the link for anyone who wants access to it. We're going to have it up on our website. It's 100% accessible to anyone who wants access. We'll answer questions. We'll have questions and answers for Rusty after he does his presentation. And then after we hear from Rusty, we're going to hear from two of the many groups who are impacted by federal funding cuts. The Partnership for the Public Good has been working on a project of putting a face to the data, telling the stories of how the federal funding changes will impact the Buffalo region. And we're going to hear from Daniela Gaggero from the Homeless Alliance of Western New York and Spencer Morgan from the Teddy Roosevelt site. Thank you, Daniela and Spencer, for taking your time to come and talk to us this morning. They'll also take questions and answers. So now let's hear from Dr. Rusty Weaver.
All right, thank you. It's rare for a data guy to be a featured speaker at something like this. Normally, I'm used to sharing data and putting folks to sleep, so hopefully we won't do that today. But like Kathy said, we just want to really give a shout out again to the Community Foundation of Greater Buffalo. A lot of this was their idea. They approached us with this, and the idea for the project is not just to roll out what we have today and let it sit there, but this is supposed to be an expansive project. And so what we're launching today, we're really calling phase 1 of this project. And the reason that it's phase 1 is because a lot of the impacts that we expect are going to take shape in New York State across all of our communities in the coming years haven't necessarily done so yet. We don't see all of the data yet because not all of the actions have been taken. So as things get implemented, as policy changes happen, we want to see how changes unfold in New York State in response to that. And so the reason for this is the Center for Economic and Policy Research wrote an article at the beginning of the year saying that January really marked a major shift in US economic policy, that it became a way to reshape the economy that's going to have ripple effects across the global economic order. And some of the policy changes that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, we see sweeping tariffs in an effort to bring manufacturing back to domestic production. We see a lot of government efficiency efforts, or efforts in the name of government efficiency, such as downsizing, federal layoffs, budget cuts. There have been drastic cuts in support for scientific research, in foreign aid and academic support generally. There's been an extension of tax cuts that have benefits that really flow to the top. So a lot of the tax cuts that have happened under the working families tax cuts are actually benefiting the highest earners in the top 20%. And then there's been a big push for deregulation. And so what we're trying to track is, all of those impacts or all of those policy changes are going to affect New York's communities and communities across the United States very differently and in many different ways. And there are going to be a lot of data points that come out in the next year to 2 years that are going to allow us to track the depth of some of these cuts. But what we have right now is a preliminary look at where things might be heading. And so the launch of this tool today, which I'll pull up here, and we'll share this link out for folks who want to play around with the data themselves. But what we have right now are decent data on changes in the number of jobs that we see in New York State and its counties, as well as some changes preliminarily from budget cuts that have already happened as part of the fiscal year 2025 budget that just ended on September 30th, so about a month ago from today. And so there are 3 main interfaces on the tool for folks who want to engage with it. It should be fairly user-friendly, but we wanted to use this space and this time just to give a broad tutorial on how to use it, because I'm sure the data points that I will demonstrate here and show to all of you won't be the specific ones that you might be interested in looking at. And so we'll try to give you a sense for how to work with this data and zero in on some of the findings that you might be more interested in. To begin, the main interface starts with a look at jobs. Jobs data are tracked by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. There's a quarterly census of employment and wages that publishes data on the number of jobs in our economy, in our counties, by industry, by ownership for every quarter. And so this is a near real-time check on the number of jobs in our economy. It is a snapshot, so technically speaking, I'm gonna bore all of you to death at some point, right? I have to go off on this. It's not a time series per se, but it's used to track historical trends, right? And so the QCEW allows us to see if the number of jobs are going up or down in different locations. And so what we've done is we've charted a relative history, a 10-year history of QCEW data on jobs in New York State by quarter. And then we're pinging that with a series of monitors on the right-hand side over here that just look at how changes are taking shape after the implementation of this new economic agenda. And so right now we're just looking at the changes in the number of jobs in New York State relative to the end of last year, relative to December of 2024. And that's how all of these tools on the right-hand side of the screen that you see are set up. As new data become available, we'll still have it pinged to the end of 2024 so that we can see the cumulative effects of policy changes over time. Right now, the current QCEW data for New York State and for the US is for the first quarter only of 2025, so through March of 2025. So the changes that I'm about to describe are those that have taken place in absolute terms just since the end of last year, but over a 3-month period. And so looking at the QCEW for New York State, overall, the state saw a decrease of about 121,000 jobs from December 24 to March of 25. And the concentration of those jobs by industry are in industries that might be affected by this new economic agenda. So we see a big decrease in accommodation and food services, which are precarious jobs to begin with, but they're also highly dependent on things like tourism. And we've seen a lot of decreases in tourism to the US, to New York State, especially internationally, from our neighbors over in Canada in recent months. And so this might be having an effect of why we're seeing some job loss in that industry in particular. The other industries that have been affected potentially most heavily are those that tend to be tariff-exposed industries. Wholesale trade, transportation, and warehousing. These are industries where if tariffs are in fact decreasing spending and creating these ripple effects throughout the economy, these are the industries where we might expect to see job losses, and that's the pattern that is taking shape early on in the year 2025. We wanted to pull out, though, and single out, because it is part of the federal economic agenda, to begin slashing some federal jobs. And so just in the first 3 months of the year, we saw about 1,700 federal workers, a net loss of about 1,700 federal workers in New York State, and about 460 state governmental employees as well. Now, the map is set up so that if you hover over any county, you can get very specific information on the number of jobs that were in that county in December and the number of jobs that were reported there in March and the change. The map is also set up to be interactive. So if you're interested in the 8-county Western New York area and you want to use the map to select those counties, all of the monitors over on the right will automatically update for you. So in our 8-county region since December, between December and March, we seem to have lost about 10,000 jobs, and the pattern of those losses are concentrated much like they were at the state level, in tourism industries and tariff-exposed industries. So that's one way of using these tools. You can also use the drop-down menus to select the variable that you want to see in the map. So we can even look at all jobs that were lost at the county level, and then hovering over the map will update the data that you see on the pop-up on the fly so that you can look at all jobs instead. And then you can also filter if you want to select counties from a drop-down list rather than using the map to click on them. We have that option above as well. The second area that the phase 1 version of this tool covers is federal spending. And federal spending comes in 2 varieties. There are grants and assistance that go to non-federal organizations who serve a public purpose. So especially things like nonprofits, higher educational institutions, hospitals. These are organizations that serve a public purpose and tend to get federal grants and assistance. The other domain is contract spending, which is where federal agencies located in New York State are spending money to do their work, whether that's on outside consultants or whether it's for goods and services. Federal organizations are spending money that goes directly into New York State's economy and can have that multiplier effect and create more dollars throughout our economy. So we'll start off by looking at assistance, which is down at the bottom of the screen. As you can see me clicking on it, there's a little button that says federal assistance. What? Oh, am I on the wrong? I've been doing stuff up here the whole time and you're just telling me this? Let's see. Some tech person I am. I can't even display it. I think I am. Yeah, I've got to exit out of it. Aha, there we go. So I've been playing with this the whole time. Nobody's going to call me out on this? All right. So I guess I'll go back to the jobs page. This is where everything started, right? So what I could see, and apparently what you could not, is just how to use this tool. So we again have monitors set up on the right side of the screen to track the changes relative to the end of last year. The map itself is usable or functional, so if you choose a region or counties that you'd like to look at, everything will update on the fly for you over here. And so this was what I was describing of overall job changes since December, about 10,000 in our region. We lost about 111 federal workers on net just in Western New York since December. Federal workers, we also have another tool out there that's on our Cornell CARO website, the Center for Applied Research on Work, that describes the federal workforce for New York State and talks about their race, ethnicity, looks at how large it is in different regions, and 111 federal workers in our region is a big chunk. Those are workers that on average are earning about $85,000 a year, just with the positions that we see in federal government work in Western New York, and so that's potentially a lot of money coming out of our economy. So yes, the map itself is interactive and will allow you to change the data monitors on the side. You can change the variable that you map by the first drop-down menu on the top, and you can select a list of counties. If you're not sure where a county is and you can't click on it on a map, then you can choose it from the list. Now going on to the federal assistance portion. So this is going to track, again, changes from fiscal year 24, so the budget cycle that was fully under the previous administration, fully under, let's say, a different economic agenda, relative to fiscal year 2025, which just ended on September 30th, and saw some initial cuts and changes in funding allocations or funding obligations. And so all of the data for the spending aspects of this tool come from usaspending.gov, which is just a Treasury Department website that line by line tracks federal transactions. So every outflow of federal resources, of financial resources, gets tracked there. And so we just grabbed all of the data for New York State and looked at how assistance obligations changed for work being performed in New York State. And relative to last fiscal year, down at the bottom we have a little history so that you can look at historical perspective to see if things are becoming or returning to normal or becoming less than normal. But overall, just in the last fiscal year, we saw a decrease of about $7.6 billion in commitments and spending commitments to New York State in terms of grants and assistance. And the biggest areas that were hit are project grants and direct payments with unrestricted uses. And that's a jargony term, but direct payments with unrestricted uses tends to be things like veterans benefits, Social Security disability, SSI, key programs that a lot of folks in our communities rely on. We have a breakdown too. There's a table underneath the graphical breakdown that shows by industry type. So this is a mutually exclusive and exhaustive list of the types of recipients of federal assistance that exist in the database. And so it just breaks down the change, year-over-year change in allocations or obligations to those specific types of entities. And so what stands out in particular are individual grants. So grants that are going to people generally, to our residents, were cut by or decreased in total amount by about $3.1 billion from fiscal year 24 to 25. Nonprofits in particular, we'll hear from some partners very soon, they saw allocations or obligations decrease by about $2.3 billion from fiscal year 24 to 25. And now what I want to stress with this is just the surface level of these cuts. A lot of experts will say that fiscal year 26 and then 27 are going to be where some of the deepest cuts that were made are actually going to go into effect. So this is just an indicator of where things might be heading in terms of what is being funded or not funded at the federal level in New York State. Now that being said, just like with the jobs section, you can use the map to filter out the data so that you can zoom into our community in particular. And so in Western New York alone, we saw, we can call it a loss or at least a net decrease of about $167 million in grants and assistance, with a lot of that, again, going to individuals and our nonprofit partners and the nonprofits that exist and do work here in Western New York. The last section of this tool covers the other type of federal spending that I mentioned, which is contract spending. And this is where, again, federal agencies are sending money out to organizations that are performing work in New York State, that are performing consulting work or doing construction work, or they're just buying goods and services to make federal offices in New York State run. And so there's a lot of information that is covered by that data set because the federal government does like to track who it's giving money to perform work. And generally, it's giving money to entities that have some sort of progressive procurement policies attached to it. So historically, the US government has had progressive procurement policies to pay for goods and services through MWBEs, through minority and women-owned business enterprises. They've generally put a premium on funding construction projects that use some sort of labor standards or prevailing wage standards. And so we try to track as much of that as we can in this set of tools. Overall, contract spending in New York State between the two fiscal years I mentioned is down about $8.2 billion. Again, that represents a pretty large flow of money that's going into New York State. But we have a drop-down menu that allows you to break that number down by certain types of categories. And so by default here, we're showing the contracts that have gone to MBEs, minority-owned business enterprises in New York State. And what we see between fiscal year 24 and 25 is kind of just a general trend, a big decrease, regardless of the type of MBE that's receiving federal money and doing federal work. We just see a pretty big drop off already. And again, this is potentially a sign of what's to come, since this is only the fiscal year 2025 budget at this point, which just ended last month. We also have breakouts by selected industries that are relevant to some New York State policy or issue areas, things like solar and wind energy production, apprenticeship training, human rights organizations, skilled nursing facilities. We see the contract dollars to all of these types of organizations also falling pretty considerably over the last fiscal year. We can break out minority and women-owned business enterprises particularly, and especially women-owned business enterprises in New York State have seen their contract activity with the federal government drop off pretty precipitously over the last fiscal year. In terms of construction labor standards, there's again a general downward trend in funding and committing funds, I should say, to construction projects in New York State that use progressive labor standards like prevailing wage requirements, a decrease of about $750 million. Labor standards and prevailing wage, a decrease of about $465 million year over year there. So we're just trying to set up as much information here and pull out as much information from these contract spending records that allow users, potentially some of you in this room, to see where contract spending has decreased, in what shape, and then draw some conclusions from that based on what you find. The last piece of information that we have here in the drop-down menu, like I said, contract spending also covers goods and services that are bought to make federal agencies run. And so we know the source. We know where those products are coming from, whether they're domestic or abroad. And since part of the new economic agenda is an America First agenda, it's a relevant bit of information. And we can see that domestic spending has actually decreased pretty heavily over the last fiscal year, while international spending has ticked up. So maybe at odds with what we would expect, given the objectives that we see at the federal level. The last thing that I'll say is, just like before, you can use the map to filter out the data for any particular region and see how, for example, our minority and women-owned business enterprises have been faring over the past couple of fiscal years and whether contract amounts have been falling. So that is the tool. The link will be provided to everyone here. I think that was probably still stuck on my screen when the PowerPoint was still up there. It's not an address that's super easy to remember, so we'll flood it out on email, but if you Google search for the Cornell ILR Buffalo Collab, we'll have it on our website as well. So that is what we're here to launch today, but mainly, I want to stop talking and introduce Daniela, who's going... Oh, sure, yeah, if there are questions, happy to.
Job statistics that we're getting, are you confident in those numbers since there's been some changes in the Bureau of Labor Management?
Well, so the question was, with the changes at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, how confident are we in the data? And for those of you who have been following this story, there was a firing of a chief statistician at the Bureau of Labor Statistics back in August or September in response to the June jobs report. The June 2025 jobs report showed really weak job growth, and after that, there was a move to let the chief statistician go. But after the benchmark revisions that the BLS did using established methodology, that June jobs report actually turned negative, right? So even after that person was removed, there wasn't a big change in what happened. In fact, the trend that we saw became even sharper, and we saw even greater job loss than what was anticipated. So the methodology has stayed the same, and I don't think that there's been any fudging the numbers for that reason in particular, but the big problem right now is that we are in a shutdown, and so these data are not being published anymore. The next release is set to happen for Q2 of 2025 on December 3rd, and unless the shutdown is resolved by that point, we just won't get the data. And so as much as we want to keep these tools updated so that you have a fresh look at how New York State is being impacted, we are wholly reliant right now on federal data, and so we're optimistic and hopeful that the shutdown will end so that we can keep this going for sure.
So I think you answered my question. I think you all hear me. Just to
Yes, sir.
So, and then you talked just now about the fact that this is still behind because the information that you're trying to collect, you can't really shut down. That being said, do you have this is still a big hit for a short period of time.
It is.
So, do you have any feelings, you're the data guy, about how much more this could increase when we do catch up with the first quarter of the year? That's a lot of people, that's a lot of money.
The money is going to get much worse. So the budget the latest budgets for fiscal year 2026 has some even sharper cuts than what we saw relative to 2025, and they are in concentrated areas. A lot of cuts have been happening in social services programs, for example, in higher education, and those areas will probably see even more pressure on New York State to come in and fill gaps that the federal government has typically filled. So it's, I think Kathy described it as sobering information, and it sure is.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit to how the federal assistance data is collected? I'm curious if it's representative of funds that were allocated and not received by organizations, or if it also includes programs that were canceled and thus the funds not.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are two main numbers that we can look at. Well, first of all, how it's collected, organizations self-submit it. So the Treasury Department has an internal system that all federal agencies, every federal account needs to report to, most of them on a daily basis, but some on a weekly basis. And so those data records get updated on the 15th of every month. So we have the full fiscal year for 2025 incorporated into this tool, but it is self-reported by the folks who are in charge of all of the federal accounts. But there are two distinct concepts with federal spending that are covered in the data set. They are obligations and outlays. Obligations are monies that we have committed for some purposes. Outlays are when the money actually gets spent. Federal agencies and those account holders were not required to report all of their outlays in a consistent manner until ARP funding happened, and so until 2022. So we don't have consistent data over time on outlays, but what we can look at are obligations and de-obligations, which is when the federal government does cancel obligations that it had previously committed to. And so there have been de-obligations in fiscal year 2025, as there are every year, but potentially more so in fiscal year 2025, that are built into this. So we're looking here at the obligations and the commitments that we have. When the next fiscal year's data set comes out, we'll also be able to compare the outlays to that to see how actual spending happened as well.
Regarding the federal jobs numbers, I know that you produced a net display of the loss of federal jobs, but also that the federal government has, in certain areas like Department of Homeland Security, there's been promotional efforts to have recruitment. Does that number, is there a way to get a breakdown of the increase and decrease and how that levels out, or does it just give us?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the data set that we're drawing on from the Bureau of Labor Statistics only jumbles every federal worker together. So there's not, at the organizational level, we haven't been able to track that in this tool yet. However, one of the areas that we've discussed with the Community Foundation is in trying to build out these tools so that it becomes more expansive. And of course, there are budget items where we can identify the size of federal workforces by agency. And so that's not built into this yet, but that will be something that we can disentangle. So yeah, in some cases, there have been, especially in border counties, hiring initiatives for especially ICE and Homeland Security, and that's going to wash out some of the deeper layoffs that have been happening in other organizations.
Do your numbers from 2020 and 2021, do those include the payroll protection loans that went out during COVID?
Yes, they do, yeah. So those actually get classified under assistance. Even though they were originally initiated as loans and then were forgiven, they're embedded as grants and assistance. And so you will see in the time series a pretty big spike at 21 that stays really high in 22 and then starts to taper off.
Any of the data on the job losses have a, can you tell what the gender is of people that are losing these jobs?
Not yet, unfortunately. Yeah, they're just, everybody's coded as a job. So we don't have that yet. However, This isn't part of this project, but Kathy and I have presented on this at other forums. There is a different data set called the Current Population Survey, which is where we get our monthly jobs report from the BLS. And with that, in the micro data of that, you can analyze the data to see by gender and race and ethnicity who is being hired or fired. And I don't have the updated numbers in my head, but as of June when we last presented it, with all of the federal layoffs that were happening, the largest demographic group that was affected, both in absolute terms and relative terms, and absolute is significant because population-wise it's a smaller group, were Black women.
And the other part of Crystal's question too would be, of those who were called back to work
Yeah.
and those who weren't called back to work found other employment and are making less money, significantly less money
Right.
than the federal job they had.
Yeah, this is something, we have a wonderful colleague in Ithaca who's Ian Greer, who's been doing interviewing of folks who were laid off and seeing where they land. So we'll hopefully have maybe some nuance to add to that through his work and through his project. For us, being dependent on a lot of these public external data sources, we're on a lag. And so we have to sort of wait for the data to compile and come out before we can declaratively give you that information, but just anecdotally. We can see certain groups being affected more than others, for sure.
Can I chime in here too, Chris? We are doing a project with Erie County and the Commission on the Status of Women. And it follows a project that we did earlier this year, and the focus there is on women of color and the impact. And we started our focus groups yesterday on that. As Rusty said, we're compiling research. So the numbers right now are just for the first 3 months of the year. Like none of the job loss numbers include the fork in the road or any of the other mass layoffs that happen after March. So stay tuned on that.
Speaking of layoffs too, I might be wrong about this. It looked like when you were at the full New York State level, there were around 400 state jobs lost, and that it looked like when you clicked on our region, that we lost basically all of the state jobs.
Yeah,
What's
so
that about?
yeah, these tools are aggregates. So there are going to be some counties that saw increases in governmental jobs. You know, one of our variables here that we can map are just the landscape of all government jobs. So this will include local as well. And there are some regions that did see pretty big gains. Why that's the case, I don't have that information offhand. But yeah, Erie County was definitely hit. And as a relative percentage, I forget exactly how many federal workers we have in the county, but 111 of them is a sizable coalition of people.
Is there a way to desegregate the data by zip code rather than by county?
Unfortunately, no. The smallest resolution that we get these at are at the county level. There are tools, New York State Department of Labor, for example, has a dedicated website for the WARN Act so that larger layoffs are all tracked and filed with that system. And so that gets down to the actual site location. So there is some geographic information there on where large layoffs are happening. But these are the finest resolution we have right now are county, unfortunately.
So what do you think? Maybe we should come back in 6 months and see how we're doing? Yeah. All right.
All right. Thank you. And I
Wait, I just want to say one other thing. We're going to go on a road show with this, so like I'm sure that the New York State Association of Counties is going to want to hear what this data is, and then if the state wants us to come and do any programs, we did meet with, who did we meet with at the state?
Ways and Means Committee.
Ways and Means, yeah, okay. And so if anybody wants us to present this information, let us know.
Thank you. And I'd like to bring Daniela up here now to speak on and put a face to some of these changes that we see happening in the data.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Daniela Gallego. I am the Continuum of Care Supervisor here at the Homeless Alliance of Western New York. At the Homeless Alliance, we serve as the continuum of care lead, and we are determined to make homelessness rare, brief, and non-reoccurring in our community. We oversee the HUD funding that keeps our housing programs alive. We make sure that those dollars are being used efficiently and where they're needed most. And we use data to drive real change to make sure what we do works. But behind these numbers are people, parents, veterans, older adults, and children who, because of these programs, now have a safe place to call home. Over the years, we have secured $23.7 million in HUD funding, housing about 2,000 people in permanent supportive housing across Western New York. Now, all of that progress is under threat. On September 29th, Politico reported that more than half of the 2026 HUD funding for homelessness programs, specifically permanent supportive housing, could be cut. HUD employees warned that the funding for permanent supportive housing can be reduced by 70%. That's 70%. This would bring our funding from $23.7 million to $7 million. We're talking about people's lives here. These are families with children. These are individuals living with disabilities, chronic illness, and trauma who have finally found stability. And now they're at risk of losing everything again. Here in Erie County, we have an estimated 5,000 people experiencing homelessness. From that number, there are approximately 3,250 from the city of Buffalo. If these cuts go through, about 2,000 human beings across Western New York, our neighbors, could return back to homelessness. Right now, we already face challenges to support the approximate 200 people currently living in the streets. Now imagine 2,000 people losing their homes, the people that have dedicated their career to serve, and the landlords that rely on the steady rental payments. This would disseminate our homeless nonprofit sector. There's no other way to call it but a man-made disaster. We cannot picture how this would change our community, but all I can say is that the impact would be catastrophic and that this would last for generations to come, not just for those losing their homes, but for our entire community, for the healthcare system, for our law enforcement, for our neighborhoods, and for the children who once again have no place to sleep at night. Picture this, someone who has finally have a safe place to call home, then to suddenly return back to the cold streets, to relive a traumatic experience that they fought to escape. We cannot and we must not allow this to happen because we have worked too hard, we've come too far, that they are our neighbors, our coworkers, our friends, and our family members. When we invest in housing, we invest in people. And that's how we build a community where everyone can thrive. So thank you again for coming and supporting the voices of our unheard in Western New York community. So I would like to bring up Spencer Morgan from the Theodore Roosevelt inaugural site.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for being with us today. I will be very brief. The Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural National Historic Site is the only national park site here in Western New York, and we have had a front row seat of a lot of the cuts that have been happening at the federal level. We are one of the only national park sites operating at full capacity in the country right now. And for those, just a plug, if you are an Erie County resident and you haven't voted yet, please make your way down the street to 641 Delaware Avenue to the site to cast your early ballot now through Sunday. We are the premier example of where cultural heritage and civic engagement collide. We are the first building in Buffalo and Erie County added to the National Register of Historic Places, and part of that enabling legislation required that a local nonprofit be formed to raise dollars to restore, save, maintain, and operating the site at 641 Delaware Avenue, the home of Ansley Wilcox and the site of where Theodore Roosevelt took the presidential oath of office following the assassination of President William McKinley here in our fair city of Buffalo in 1901. Racial justice, environmental conservation, big business and labor relations. We also talk about global affairs. These are all the key issues that TR was facing in 1901. These are the issues we are facing now. The story is the same, the context is just a little different. When TR became president, he expanded presidential power for reform. And the political climate is much different today than it was in 1901. TR was a Republican, he was a former New York governor, and he was a progressive. And his lasting legacy has been the National Park Service. So while our friends with the National Park Service are currently furloughed because of the government shutdown, we continue to fight for our national parks because we know better than anyone here in Western New York that when there are cuts to any human service organizations and when there is an economic crisis or an economic unknown, we know that our arts and cultural nonprofits usually end up at the bottom of that philanthropic barrel. That's a huge impact here in Western New York as we have built a massive economic driver in Western New York through cultural tourism. At the TR site, we crunched some numbers. In March alone of 2024, we went from 72 bus groups coming from Canada to 21 in March of 2025. We have seen the impact of what is happening at the federal level, internationally and nationally. And while we bring in over 30,000 visitors a year, we know that every dollar that we spend operating that site brings $2 more back to the Western New York economy. We are here to support our human service organizations and all of our organizations that receive federal funding because we know that cuts to any of us are cuts to all of us. Thank you.
All right, so that concludes our program. Thanks all for coming, and we will let you know when we're convening again, when we get updated numbers. And reach out if you want any information.